Welcome to Money Market, a Bank of Tampa podcast. We highlight the businesses, expert business advice, the local economy, and points of interest in the Tampa Bay market. Follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you find your finer podcasts. And be sure to share this episode with a friend or colleague. I'm your host, Owen Lefebvre, the Pinellas County Market President for the Bank of Tampa, Tampa's oldest and largest community bank. Today, we're joined by Christina Georgacopoulos, who covers banking and finance for the Tampa Bay Business Journal. She joined the Tampa Bay Business Journal newsroom in January of 2022 after graduating from Louisiana State University with a master's in journalism. So you're a Tiger.
Mm-hmm. Go Tigers.
Did you know that LSU was originally a military academy?
Yes, I did. The presence is still maintained like slightly on campus, but I learned that afterwards.
So there's a military guard there?
Yeah. And did you know LSU is one of only a handful of banking programs in the United States?
I did know that, given my banking background. I ended up going to Wharton and Stonier at Penn, but I did look into LSU. I wanted to get out of market. I thought Philadelphia would be fun. So you report on a variety of subjects in banking and financial services industry, from private equity to investing, traditional banking, professional services, M&A, insurance. And I will tell you that obviously you're not a banker, but what I've really appreciated about you is that you are a student. You ask some great questions. You try to be very thoughtful in how you approach things. You really look to understand what is a very complex industry, and especially in light of all the crazy things that happened in 2023 in the banking industry. It was nuanced, and you looked to understand the nuance in the industry and not jump on. There's a handful of people that look for one specific thing and gave that as that was the reason any bank was going to fail. But you didn't do that. So I've got you here to talk about the big stories of 2023. But if you'll indulge me a minute, I'm really curious about your process. So you ask great questions. What's your process in asking questions?
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And the process, it's an art, it's not a science. And a lot of it is just talking to people, a lot of emails, sources, reaching out with tips. And, when I first started, you asked me, let me know when you feel like you've hit your stride. And I feel like that really only happened probably in the last 6 months. And a big part of that is just building a source network. I had, my goal was 100 bankers in the first 100 days and just get out there and meet people. And
did you meet your goal?
I tried 100 people. That was
aggressive.
A big goal.
I'm impressed.
I think I've made the rounds now. I've met pretty much every banker that I'd like to meet in Tampa. I shouldn't say that, but there's a lot. And I learned
this interview's over.
And, Tampa is a small community, so it's not hard. But the process is, I will say it's a lot of fun, a lot of learning. I love learning, and I didn't come from a banking or finance background. So that is a big part of the process, is knowing I have experts on hand, accountants, lawyers, people who can walk me through a really complex issue. But yeah, inspiration comes from all over. And I think, especially for banking and finance, digging into data and, SEC filings, I've spent more time than I'd care to admit looking through those. And, really just talking to people and then sitting down and coming up with an angle. And, if it doesn't pan out, reaching out to those people again and asking more questions. So it's every story looks a little bit different, but that keeps it exciting. So
in terms of finding your stories, how much is it of you just kind of reacting to what's going on, or being proactive, or people reaching out to you? I mean, what's kind of the mix there?
I'd say probably 50-50, but a good example is in March during the whole banking panic crisis, whatever you want to call it. I don't know if I'd call it a crisis. That was, what do we need to know about this situation? How could this have a local impact? And going out and making those stories. And, bankers were still trying to understand what was happening. And so I guess being on the front lines and driving the narrative rather than, hearing things through the grapevine and writing stories after the fact. That was an interesting time.
Ian, you definitely were on the front lines, and I think made everybody a little nervous when you were reaching out. But no, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about it. But you did a great job and very thoughtful approach to what's a complex industry. In terms of writing, what's your writing process?
I love writing. It's every story requires something different, but I think coming up with the lead, the first sentence, that hard hitting, what is this story about? And it's worth mentioning, our audience is unique. We don't write for consumers. We write for businesses and write about businesses. So you always think in terms of who's reading this and why would they want to read this? And the local angle also makes that a lot easier. In Tampa, there's really no shortage of things happening here, but the writing process is, some stories can take 20 minutes, some stories take 4 hours. Then we also do longer form centerpiece stories that go in our print edition. Those can take, multiple days. But writing is, you just have to let it flow naturally. And sometimes I don't really believe in writer's block or that concept. It's whenever I feel that way, it's usually I need to go read some more, talk to some more people.
Okay, so you don't try to force your way through it?
Mm-mm.
All right, so everybody tuned in for the summary and kind of just the recap of what were the big stories of 2023. 2023 was a crazy year.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like there was a ton going on, and we were having a conversation earlier in the office just about Black Swan events and how often they used to happen, and it seems like they're happening a lot more frequently. But so, I mean, what are the top stories?
This is a mixture of stories that I think personally were really important and impactful, and then others that just performed really well and got a lot of attention for whatever reason. And sometimes I never know. I write a story that I think is just offhanded, a quick 30-minute story, and it gets tons of attention, which one of them was Bank of Tampa, which I will note at the end. The top two were first in February, Citigroup unveiled its $60 million brand new campus. They have 10,000 employees here in Tampa, which I think a lot of people were surprised to hear that. Really big moment for them in this region. I think they've been here for 20 or 30 years. I could be wrong on that number. And then, of course, in September, Jane Fraser comes out and announces really sweeping layoffs and a reorganization of the bank. And it's the largest in the world in terms of their presence. They have like 250,000 employees. They're all over the map. And
so do you know what the utilization is of their campus now that they've downsized? Do you have any?
I don't know. I have been in touch with a few current and former employees that have already been laid off. And it was funny. One of them told me that, they have this beautiful state-of-the-art campus. I imagine it's very similar to like Google, all these collaboration spaces. And I was asking him, what else have you heard from coworkers? And he was like, well, I go in the morning, I go to my pod and I work and I don't talk to a single person all day. And then I leave at the end of the day. Yeah, I was like, wow. So all this collaboration space.
Right. Yeah, why go into the office? You can just stay at home.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So City tops out the list.
Yeah.
So in terms of biggest story, I mean, did that get the most viewership?
The most views, which I imagine a lot of it was because of what a significant workforce they have here. And those employees themselves were like, what's going on? And that reorganization is still in process. They described it as rolling out in phases. So there's definitely more to come there. And I'll be interested what the end result of City's presence will look like here.
They're not alone. I feel like every large bank is going through that same process. And they may have been, I think, one of the first to announce, if I'm not mistaken. But that's the theme. Net interest margins are squeezed. And so the unfortunate thing is, I mean, the easy place to cut is either your real estate, which, I mean, you're tied into leases. And it's not always convenient, but people, unfortunately.
Yeah. And to add to just what's happening in banking, a really significant trend this year was cost cutting and right sizing and downsizing. Wells Fargo, I think they've laid off 10,000 employees so far this year across their whole footprint, cutting branches. Truist announced a $750 million cost-cutting exercise that will lead to layoffs. Bank of America, I know locally, has had a hiring freeze since last year. So that's definitely a common theme.
Interesting. What else you got?
The second story that personally I found really significant was Jamie Dimon visited Tampa.
That was a big deal.
Yeah, he showed some love to Tampa, which was cool. He didn't have to. But Chase, also kind of like Citi, which I think surprises people, is what a significant presence they have here. They have over 5,000 employees. Their payment center here is their largest payment center in North America, something like $10 trillion worth of payments, or like a third of all global payments flow through Tampa. You have lots of operations, really significant presence here. So he came and stopped by and, on his roadshow, I think he went to a few other markets, and it was cool. I got to sit down and talk to him for 15 minutes.
How did that interview?
I'm building a relationship with their team, and, I had worked a lot with their head of private banking, Chris Brandriff. He's a really great guy. And, journalists don't always enjoy the PR schmoozing part of the job and building those relationships, but they have a really great communications team over there, and always meaningful stuff that they give me and put in my lap. So,
well, that was a big one. I mean, he doesn't sit down with a lot of people. I should say maybe local publications. So I know he does a lot nationally and will speak on TV from time to time. But that was a big find. So, I mean, what was your experience with him?
It was so cool. And a funny story is I'm Greek, obviously my last name, and Jamie Dimon is Greek. And when I got this job, the first thing my dad said was, there's one thing you need to know is the top banker in the United States or globally is a Greek. So that it was just funny seeing that come full circle, and especially after so early on in my career.
Yet you're done. I mean, you can drop the mic right now.
I was like, this is great.
You hit the pinnacle of your career.
Really down to earth guy, relaxed. It was a serious interview, and he took it seriously. But you could tell he's very patriotic. He cares a lot about the bank and being, accessible to the different markets and not just sitting in an ivory tower in New York. So I thought it was really cool that he came. He didn't just showing that love to Tampa and giving us that attention. I think it was kind of the cherry on top for this region after such explosive growth during the pandemic and kind of putting us on the map.
Yeah, he spoke at the New York Times conference recently. And I don't know if you saw his interview there, but I mean, he was really concerned about income disparity and just how, inflation and the economy is impacting the lower, 30%. More than and a lot of the other people. So I mean, I did. I mean, he felt genuine, and I think at times, especially as a fat camp banker, right? You feel like you're detached, and to some degree, I mean, he probably is a little sheltered, just given the profile that he has. But at least recognizes. I mean, he has a ton of employees. So it's good to hear that he was a good guy. And it was, very, very cool win.
Yeah. And it was a week before the whole banking meltdown. So if that had happened, the timing, I know I definitely wouldn't have had that time with him. So it was cool.
So, okay. What else is on the list?
Third on the list is MUFG Mitsubishi Financial Group is opening a pretty significant office, building a hub here in Tampa. They're Tokyo based. They're the third largest bank globally, I think, or seventh largest, $3 trillion in assets. And they signed a lease, 8,000 square feet, which was the largest office lease signed in Tampa in the last 5 years, which is significant. And when I interviewed their Tampa leader, there was a mention of these other banks cutting back in Citi, and not to mention Credit Suisse and UBS and just all the different functions and shedding those jobs. And so it is a big opportunity for them to build a location here. And it would be their second or third largest, I think, in the United States. So big win for Tampa.
A lot of jobs. And so forgive me, this was all a surprise. I had no idea what these stories were going to be. But so remind me of what the employment count is what they're projecting over the next several years.
I think it's around 4,000 or 5,000.
Okay. That's a big win. That's pretty significant.
Yeah.
And these are all, these are not backroom jobs. These are all high paying jobs. Right?
Yeah, it's really jobs across it's a wholesale bank, and jobs across all operations, technology, compliance, HR. And it's also significant that they didn't choose Miami Miami has always been seen as the financial hub in its own right. But the cost of living
there are some financial leaders talking about, Miami being the new New York.
The cost of living problem, though, that comes up a lot. In migration numbers, I think we've seen sort of everyone coming from New York and the Midwest during the pandemic, and now a lot from the Miami area coming up here just because the cost of living and having a workforce here is much more affordable.
So was that the reason they cited for wanting to come to Tampa versus Miami?
Yeah.
The cost of living? Now, do you feel that's changing a little bit, just given how much, housing has increased here in Tampa? I think on a relative scale, it's still cheaper, but we're not as affordable as we once were.
That is true. The second thing to say after, us being affordable is we did have the highest inflation in the United States during the pandemic, and I think maybe even still. And that's probably here to stay. A lot of the jobs that were added during the pandemic were higher paying jobs. A lot of wealth moved here, which I will get into some of those numbers later because they're really fascinating. So that'll be sticky, and I don't think we'll see that reverse.
I think, prices don't really come down. Yeah. So, and that's, everybody keeps talking about deflation. The last time we really had true deflation was a Great Depression. So we want inflation to slow. But the problem is that wages have not kept up with the amount of inflation, so your dollar doesn't go as far. So it feels like, and you are. People are taking a lot less home, and so housing is a huge part of that.
Especially in South Tampa, it's just fascinating to see these, like the house I was living in, 600, 700 square foot, 2-bedroom, 1-bath for $400,000. It's just insane.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Did you see the one that was in the paper that was just like a tiny little shotgun house?
Maybe. I've seen a lot of those.
Okay. That wasn't your house?
No, it could have been.
It actually went under contract. I saw it and shared it and said, this is going to be a meme. And it was under contract within like 2 weeks. So we just don't have enough housing here.
There's some really great Instagram accounts of realtors going around Tampa and showing some of the properties. It's an eye-opening.
It is,
especially for young people. I don't know where they're going to live.
It's tough. We need more housing. So build, baby, build.
Yeah,
supply and demand.
So the next story, which was not a fun story, and I got some. I'm not going to say full blowback, but it was a tense time in March. A story, there was a lot of lists flying around on the internet that put some banks in the hot seat. But largest bank, or banks here with the largest portion of uninsured deposits.
Yes.
And there were quite a few on the list. And the significance of that was during March, this panic and depositors, fearful if their money was safe. And thinking back, I might have added a lot more context to that story, but it was just such a fast moving. That was, I can't even imagine how many stories I was writing a day then.
And so there was a big focus. Yes, there was a big focus on deposits because Silicon Valley Bank. And I think part of the issue is people, again, getting into the nuance of banking. So you did do a story on Bank of Tampa. And one of the things that is a little, I don't want to make this about Bank of Tampa, but we bank a lot of commercial accounts. So commercial accounts and companies, those accounts have a tendency to be larger. So as people were looking at those lists, not really truly understanding the composition of clients, what those accounts look like. That drove some of the panic, right?
But definitely. But a differentiating factor, I think, where Bank of Tampa stands out is you're one of the oldest, if not the oldest bank here in Tampa, really long-standing relationship with your clients and with the businesses that you bank. And some of these banks that I think were more concerned than others were the ones that have been really rapidly expanding here in Tampa, new to this market. Their client base is a lot younger. So that's when relationships, it's funny, my whole first year, bankers love talking about relationship banking. And that was really the moment that it became really apparent to me what that means and the importance of that in banks that truly do have relationship banking. So that was fascinating to see pan out. I'm sure you had a different experience.
We, of course, were very concerned. But I do think, to your point, we like to think of ourselves as a relationship bank. That's what we are. Our mission statement is, we build relationships. It's simple. It's a little cliche, but it's true. And that's what we strive to do every day. And so I think what really held up is that people really didn't panic. We reached out to our clients just to reassure them. They're like, you guys are great. Not concerned, not worried. But I do feel, given that period of time, and maybe the article was a little bit, you were not salacious, but if it bleeds, it reads. And it's like, that's one of the things of, high amount of uninsured deposits. And so do you think that's what kind of drove everybody to say, like, is my bank, is my bank solvent?
And I think also because no one was talking about banks or deposits or anything. And it was just such a flash in the pan.
For years.
And so now everyone's like, wait, what do you mean talking about banks, or is my bank okay? Is my money okay? Like, that's just such a far-fetched idea that's what I think drove a lot of the news coverage at that time and of audience interest.
And I think it took, it seems like we've from a regulatory standpoint, with Dodd-Frank and all the additional capital requirements that I won't say lured into a false sense of security, but after the great financial crisis and after we worked through that, we really felt the banking system was sound. But we also never experienced before the Fed increasing interest rates by 500 basis points. And that's really unheard of. Banks are required to stress test 300 basis points. And here we are at 500, and there were some banks that just didn't manage their balance sheet accordingly. And it's obviously didn't end well for them.
Caught flat-footed for sure.
For sure.
And the Bank of Tampa story.
The Bank of Tampa.
And and I have an idea why I think this performed so well, but I'm curious why you think. It was Preston Ferrier joining your Bank of Tampa's board. He's the CEO of Furman Motor Cargo. I was surprised by that, to be honest, but I know there is a lot of interest in Bank of Tampa's board. Some really excellent business minds serve on the board. But why do you think that got attention?
I'm fascinated by that one too, because that's not where I thought you were going. So of course you also read another article, which ended up being a little bit of an expose of the Bank of Tampa and just, how financially sound we were, which as you were writing that, I mean, we have had a great relationship. And so I know you were coming from a good place and trying to understand and very confident about the bank's financial strength and the management team that we have in place. But you never know, didn't know where that was going. And of course, I mean, you highlighted the issues in the industry and I thought you did a good job of really analyzing the strength of the bank. So I'm just learning this now. So Preston, obviously kind of the heir apparent in the Furman family. So Jim Furman's son-in-law, great guy, very charismatic, great businessman. And I think maybe just, the Furman family has been so generous to the community and everything that they do and give back. I think the city for folks that really know the name, understand just how generous they are. And so there is a little bit of a love affair with the Furman family because they do. I mean, they're very much, they don't have the same, I guess, profile of the Vinnicks, but they are very much, I feel like they give to everything in town. So I think some of that affinity may be there. And then just him joining, what is kind of a systemically important and visible financial institution at the Bank of Tampa. That would be my guess.
Yeah, but I would take just from what I've heard from other sources inside Bank of Tampa and outside of, there's a lot of interest in this generational shift that's going on in this succession planning of Bank of Tampa. Your leadership was so long-standing for so long. And one of my first stories at the Business Journal was when Corey stepped in as CEO.
Oh, is that right? And
so I think there's interest there about what does the next generation of the bank's leadership look like? Will things change? In that interview, it was very clearly said, this is an evolution, not a revolution, which I thought was a great quote. So that did strike me, but there's a lot of I think it also speaks to the power of local journalism and that people are interested in what people they know are doing and institutions in their market. And so that was cool.
So can you kind of, based on everything you told me there, I mean, how would you summarize kind of the 2023? What were the trends?
The prevailing word that, I can't even tell you how many times I heard was uncertainty. I think there was just, it was really unanticipated how quickly the Federal Reserve would raise interest rates. I mean, it was 500 basis points. Caught some people flat-footed. Banks are still very well capitalized. And there's, as far as I can tell and from what I've heard from bankers, there's really no concerns there. I would summarize it as uncertainty, but as we move towards the end of this year, the next phase of the cycle is moving from questions about liquidity and deposits and monetary tightening to credit quality and what do banks have in their portfolios? Where will there be problems? Obviously, office real estate has taken the cake so far. Commercial real estate,
we'll do
a lot of focus.
Podcast on that one.
So that was probably the most significant trend towards the second half of this year was credit. And what will that look like? Will some regions hurt more than others? Obviously, we were talking earlier about Florida and Tampa. There's a little bit of a cushion there from the wealth migration and just population migration here and diversity of business that we have in Tampa Bay specifically. So those are some significant trends. The deposit part though, in terms of like key moments this year, deposits, that was, no one was talking about deposits like I mentioned earlier. And every June, the FDIC comes out with their deposit market share report so we can see, how have deposits moved, especially with all the big banks, the Bank of America, Truist, and those and what have you. And it was the first annual decline in deposits since 2010. So that has been highlighted across the board by every bank that is a challenge, going back to relationship banking and, you know, just what a contrast it was from the pandemic when there's just like a glut of cash and just so much money in the system. Lending was, loan growth was insane. Maybe banks are being a little bit more careful, a little bit more cautious who they're banking with. They want the whole relationship. They're not just lending, being more critical and scrutinizing where they're lending to. So that was really
I will jump. We've had a whole generation of bankers that so I've been in banking for 22 years. 15 of those years, we didn't pay anything for deposits. And I think a lot of folks just took that for granted, weren't necessarily focused. There was plenty of liquidity in the system. And I mean, deposits were always a part of the banking conversation, but we all have kind of led with loans because we just took for granted that the deposits were there, and that shifted. So all of a sudden you had that level of deposits leaving the system, going to money market mutual funds, going into treasuries. So the banking system had to adjust, and it's just the speed. No one was prepared for the shock to the system, and it took a couple of banks out.
But it seems like deposit costs, it lagged a little bit behind interest rates rising, but that seems to have stabilized.
I feel like we're stabilized. And as we sit here today, so we're in December again for a timestamp, but the Federal Reserve, the FOMC just announced today that the rate hiking cycle is done. They're potentially going to lower, they see lowering rates at least 3 times next year. And if it's typical in the past, unless we've got a big shock to the financial system and there's a huge recession or something happens, usually they do it in 25 basis increments. So, we could see 75 basis points cut. What trends are you predicting in 2024?
Trends in 2024, definitely the focus on commercial real estate. And something, an interesting development in the past couple months or weeks at least has been, a big part of my coverage area is also private equity and investing and alternative financing and private credit. I find that a really interesting area of the market. There's a lot of cash out there that investors still need to put to work. And I've sensed they're mobilizing a lot of family offices here, especially where when banks are pulling back, when, borrowers' creditworthiness maybe isn't what it once was with the higher interest rates, that there will be this other area of the market that steps in and fills that void. So that's been an interesting, in the past month or so, just a number of investors that I've talked to who are actively doing that, other people who are like, I think that this is going to be a pretty big trend, especially in media coverage next year.
And I think, you're already seeing some of that. So the private credit market is, it's huge. It's 1.7 trillion, which is the size of the junk debt market. So I think they have really stepped in kind of post great financial crisis. The big banks just didn't lend a lot in commercial real estate. And so what ended up happening is regional banks and community banks stepped up to fill some of that void, but a lot of it was done by private credit. I'd be curious to see what you're hearing now, but we get calls all the time from it's pretty much, vulture capital, right? They're looking for distressed loans. They want to buy loans. They're looking for bank REO, and it's kind of early in the cycle. We're not seeing really any significant credit problems. And I know we're very fortunate to be in Tampa Bay and in Florida, and there's other parts of the country that aren't as fortunate. And there's property types in particular, like office is one that is going through a cycle that it needs to kind of restabilize, and it's going to take some time. But, so there's a lot of capital looking for those opportunities.
Yeah.
And not necessarily in the lending credit space. It's more acquiring distress.
Yeah. And that's a good point. And I was just the other week, I have a story coming out on Friday, so you'll have to wait to read it. A specialty finance firm over in St. Pete, exclusively, they buy loans. And they've been doing it for 20 years. So it's not like they're capitalizing on this current opportunity. But they're raising $100 million fund. They're, next year, their pipeline has already, activity's already picked up. But one thing that they mentioned I thought was interesting was cap rates are still sort of in flux. There's valuations, seeing how the value of those assets, like how it trickles through the balance sheet. It'll take some time with maturities and repricing. But
there's no transactions. So, we're going to have some of those defaults. Things are going to have to trade. And if they don't trade, nobody really knows where the market is. It's always, was sharing this story the other day, but we had a it's an office property. It's a client that bought a property it was a value add. It is not in distress. So again, if anybody's listening to this, do not call me. But no, the appraisal came in. I mean, it's 30% occupied, I think, and office. 7.5% cap, and we all just sat around and like scratched our heads and we're like, it would never trade for that today. And of course, they're well capitalized. They've got a good plan in place and have plenty of time to turn the property around. But there is that disconnect, and real estate's kind of that slow moving ship, and it takes time to adjust.
No one knows the guy who I was talking to, no one knows where the market is going, but he made an interesting note of Signature Bank. The FDIC is currently auctioning off like $30 billion in assets up in the Northeast mostly. That was one of the banks that failed earlier this year. And will be kind of evidence of where values have moved to. I thought it was an interesting point.
That'll be a good data point.
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. Christina, if people want to find you, how can they get in touch with you?
You'll have to write my really long email, which is my last name, but LinkedIn is a great spot. You can give me a call. I pick up even if it's a spam caller, I'm answering my phone. So always welcome feedback on stories and ideas and pitches and things like that.
I appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have a question or a future show idea or would like to be a sponsor, you can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram at Bank of Tampa, and online at bankoftampa.com. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for following. Until next time, adios.